actually did one webinar where we purposely didn't get to know each other first. Like, we have no idea what the other person's going to say. It'd be fun, yeah.
Oh, yeah, similar to this one, I suppose. Hey.
Hi, everyone. We are the Systems Change Alliance, and we believe that the world is in need of major change at a systemic level. Change is already happening in a lot of places around the world. In this series of interviews, we talk to people who are leading change and living the alternatives to the mainstream ways of doing things. Today, we welcome Tom Llewellyn. He's a community organizer, having co-founded several community and sharing-based initiatives, a consultant and a storyteller. He's the strategic partnership director for Shareable.net, executive producer and host of the award-winning documentary and podcast series, The Response, and the co-editor author of several books. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm Alexander, and I'll be doing the interviews. And I'm really interested in something you talks about you being a storyteller. What kind of stories do you tell?
Well, I would first like to preface it by saying, that I think that everybody is a storyteller. We convey knowledge, information through story.
Hmm.
I happen to really enjoy that part of communication, of the conveyance of history and knowledge in that way. And so I kind of refer to myself as a storyteller. I feel like a lot of the work that I've done throughout my life has been story based. But really, I think the thing that sticks with me is the story of Stone Soup, and that's probably my favorite story. And are you familiar with that story?
I am. I am very much.
So, but for those that may not be,
This is the
the
short
story of
version of the story.
yeah, the short version of story of Stone Soup basically is there's a traveler who's trying to get home after a war, which has led to a prolonged famine and kind of a a shadow of scarcity um, over an entire region. And everywhere that traveler goes, they're turned away. They're told, there's no food, there's no place for you to stay. Move on the next village, move on the next town. You're not welcome. And after a while, they think to themselves, they're not going to be able to make it home. They're going to die on the road of starvation. And they come up with a clever plan. And the next time they walk into a village and they ask for a little bit of hospitality and they're denied, they say, don't worry about me. I'm going to go into the town square and make some stone soup. And, pretty soon the rumor spreads around that there's this stranger in town that's making soup. And people start showing up one by one to see what's going on. And the traveler pulls out their magic stone and makes sure that everybody can see it, and they drop it in the pot. And after a minute or two, they dip their ladle in and take a sip, and they say, this is some good stone soup. But what would be better is stone soup with cabbage. Well, sure enough, somebody has some cabbage. They go get it. Once again, chop, chop, chop into the pot. Another few moments, taste it again. This is some good stone soup with cabbage. But would be even better, it's stone soup with some spiced beets. Well, sure enough, somebody had some spiced beets. They go get their spiced beets, they bring it back in, and pretty soon, one by one, everybody in the community has contributed something, where they're holding on to the little bits that they had and experiencing that famine, that sense of scarcity. When they came together, it provided this incredible abundance and really shows kind of the power of community and of commenting, and also that it sometimes requires a little bit of story and trickery to be able to move people in the right direction, to remind them of their humanity for lack of a better word, um, and that through that power of that story. And again, this was a storyteller that was traveling, told the story of this magical stone soup that was going to occur, that people were compelled to share. And in the end, they got to celebrate and they got to connect with each other and they got to kind of release some of that sense of famine and scarcity. And that story, I mean, my name on Facebook is Stone Soup. Like, I've been carrying that story for a long time. And I feel like it is a very strong metaphor for the work that I do and the work that we do at Shareable.
Hmm. Community development long has this story that the community development officer gives nothing. Only, only the community builds themselves, but somehow it doesn't happen without that community development seed, which is that stone, I
Yep,
guess.
yep. Yep, that spark.
So tell me about Shareable. What exactly is it?
Yeah, so Shareable's been around for over a decade at this point in time.
Mm.
And kind of we exist to promote people-powered solutions for the common good. It's a nice little fun buzzword, but it really, I think, gets down to the heart of our work. Most people know us because we are a publisher, and in the last 11 years, we've published about 4,500 stories, how-to guides, other resources,
Mm.
and on our website at shareable.net. We also do policy work, both from kind of an advocacy standpoint and also an advisory. And so we will advise various mayors and city council members and urban planners around the world, and then also from time to time participate in kind of more advocacy campaigns for an example, to kind of save seed sharing in the United States, because seed libraries were under threat a few years ago,
Right.
and they were going to be, in many states, they were starting to be banned. And so we co-led a successful campaign to save small scale seed sharing in the United States. And then the third component of our work is to support groups to kind of start new projects, or start new
Right.
sharing initiatives. They could be tool libraries or time banks or worker-owned cooperatives, internet mesh networks. And then that's kind of on the community scale, but then we also kind of work with other nonprofits on their projects if they're integrating some sort of a new sharing project, or specific research and communications.
Mm. Mm. And how did you get involved in this?
Well, I mean, I kind of was born into doing this type of work, actually. Where I am
Oh, cool.
now, I've recently moved back to the community where I was born and raised, which I refer to as a semi-autonomous, unintentional community,
Oh, I
in
like it.
the
I
San
always,
Francisco Bay Area. What was that?
I always believe in unintentional communities. I think there's a lot of value to them.
Yeah, I mean, the longevity of them seems to be a lot longer than many of the quote unquote intentional communities. But where I live now and where I grew up, while most people own their own piece of property, separate, they're not financially intertwined with other people that are living in this unincorporated part of our county. We are connected by place, and we maintain all of our own roads, and everybody's a member of a different water cooperative,
Mm.
or small scale, springs and stuff like that. Pretty much, it's all shared resources around water. We have participatory budgeting for community infrastructure projects. We have our own community governance system. My family happens to be part of 13 families that co-own 26 acres as a community land trust. And
Mm.
so I, grew up steeped in community,
Where is
in
this place?
relationship building. Um, and, and at the same time, while we were doing this really like hands-on commenting,
Mm.
it was also in the area that I'm in was completely clear cut to all these old growth redwood trees to build the Victorians in Oakland and San Francisco. And we were left with the stumps, and so as a kid we would have class where everybody, the entire class, 20 25 kids would be able to sit around the outside, with their feet dangling into the rotted part of a old growth redwood stump, and yet there was none of those old growth redwood trees left over. Not a
Wow.
single one was preserved in our region. I mean, there's a just on the hill up above where we live is the Joaquin Miller Park, where there was these two giant trees that were known as the captain's trees,
Mm.
where ship captains, when they were trying to find the opening of the San Francisco Bay Area, would circumnavigate from those trees because it was so hard to find the opening because of the fog.
Mm.
And they cut those trees down, and there's a little plaque on the ground. So I grew up both with this understanding of what it takes to maintain and manage resources collectively as a community, and what happens if you don't have foresight, if you don't, what that kind of with that deep sense of loss for
Mm.
having not been able to be in proximity and to experience what those trees were like, what that ecosystem was like. And so both those things in concert have really kind of propelled a lot of my work.
Where is this place?
It's just in the hills behind Oakland, California.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. But so that work kind of got me going. And then, I worked on a number of different community projects. I co-led an organization called the Sustainable Living Roadshow,
Hmm.
for about 5 years, and we ran a whole kind of eco festival carnival tour with trucks and trailers and buses and domes and tents and a whole carnival midway. It was basically a sustainability festival that we had on the road across the United States for 5 years. And then that led me, or as a group, we started to kind of think about the need for permanent infrastructure, as we were this mobile organization. And so we started a place for sustainable living in Oakland, California, which stands for People Linking Art, Community, and Ecology. And it's a tiny house village. It's got a maker space, a fab lab, community garden, an event space, and co-working. And it's kind of like an urban eco village right in the middle of Oakland. And then so from there, I got excited about starting more infrastructure and started a tool library in Asheville, North Carolina, and did other sharing projects out there. And the goal was to then go back on the road and help other communities to kind of replicate some of these permanent infrastructure pieces.
Hmm.
And that's when I came across Shareable, who'd been around for a few years at that point in time, and they said, "Hey, why don't you come and do that with us?" And so got hired to help communities put on events and build out their local infrastructure, and have been working with Shareable now for about 6 years.
You mentioned commoning. What exactly do you mean by commoning?
Well, there's the kind of classic uh, definition of commoning, which is that there's a resource, a group of people, and some sort of a governance management system for maintaining and managing that resource.
Hmm.
So we think about kind of more like resource commons, like fisheries and forests, things, grazing lands, where there's lots of people that are kind of managing that resource together. They have their own ways of dealing with each other and making sure they're able to maintain it over time. And there's still, it's been estimated there's over 1 billion people that are gaining their daily sustenance from resource commons still on the planet. With all the industrialization, with everything that we've seen, there's still people doing that. But it's in the last number of years, the concept of commoning has really expanded, and you know now we're thinking more about urban commons, and so that might include things like tool libraries or uh, community land trusts, and uh, it can be related to kind of energy, like kind of renewable energy cooperatives or um, different kind of alternative finance techniques. There's like so many different things, and so that's something that we got really excited about at Shareable, and kind of see a lot of overlap in our work. And in 2016, we kicked off a 2-year project with 15 fellows from 9 different countries to kind of look at a kind of the big picture of urban commoning around the world.
Hmm.
And we ended up producing a book called Sharing Cities Activating Their Urban Commons, which looks at over 137 different examples of commoning uh, through finance and work and food and technology and governance, uh, you know, energy, water, waste, kind of all these 11 different core city sectors, and how not only are communities kind of from the grassroots bottom up helping to meet those needs of every city through kind of commons processes, but also the other half of the book is the ways that cities are working to empower their citizens to participate in the provisioning of those
Hmm.
core city needs.
Hmm. Some people talk about the tragedy of the commons. There's an argument against it. Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, there was actually an article that was just came out pretty
We should
recently.
first explain what is meant by the tragedy of the commons, because not everyone will know that.
Sure, I mean the kind of the concept around it. Garrett Hardin, who is a professor in University of California, and he's a very complicated person. I can get into him a little bit more in a moment. But the kind of the guy who kind of put forward, the tragedy of the commons, his argument was that without kind of an official regulatory system, that people will um, essentially use up all the resources because it's in their, for their personal interest.
Mhm.
and will negatively impact the community and everything like that because there's not a top-down regulatory system. And that, so that's kind of like the idea is that we can't actually common resources because people will hoard and people will take more than their share. And so you need a government to manage it. Um, is one aspect of it. I don't know if you want to add anything
No,
more.
it's okay. It's okay.
And one, but he's also a free market capitalist, and and
Well, he
so
believes in that, he's got an investment in that idea.
yep,
Yeah.
and so I would argue that there's lots and lots of evidence that we've seen that free market capitalism will make it so that the biggest fish will take the most resources, and as we've seen with clear cutting redwood forests, with overfishing, with all these different things, that even these this regulatory systems don't really work as well as pure managed relational systems. And part of the idea with the that we're now looking back at that idea of the tragedy commons is really seeing that you know uh, Hardin, who wrote this, was somebody who uh, was felt like it's been referred to as having lifeboat ethics, meaning that um, since global resources are finite, that he believed that the rich should be able to throw the poor overboard and be able to hold on to the resources that are available. Has been now is like on lists as being basically a white nationalist and had really protectoratory, viewpoints. Um, and so there's a lot of people that are now looking back at that and we're like, wait a second, maybe we don't want to, like, there's just so much influence that has come from that article and from this person, which has very contradictory views to what society is looking like today. And so that kind of, not only is there a kind of a flaw in the person that promoted this idea, there is a clear flaw in the concept of it as well, which we have kind of really highlighted throughout our work at Shareable and throughout our book, is showing that no, like, this is happening. Like, commenting is happening every day all over the place, and our communities are stronger for it.
Yeah, and we're actually seeing a lot of natural growth in that in the internet, which at least demonstrates how people like to share.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so commoning, it's kind of important that people are able to share in some way. Right? But the question is okay, if we're not going to have top-down government regulations, how are we organizing this in a way that does keep some kind of management, at least, if
Mm-hmm.
not control?
Well, one, I personally don't believe that there's no place for top-down government management.
Right.
I think that these things work in concert. Uh, and there are certain large scale infrastructure resources which I think need some sort of a governing body to be maintaining and you know to be able to keep those things going into absentia. That there are so many um, resources that you need that kind of bureaucracy and to be able to do I think for the longevity of them. And there's other things that don't. And one of the things that I think that, especially here in the United States, we don't have any concept, for the most part, of commons, of there being a third way. We have the government and all that kind of top down structure, and then we have the market. And it was interesting, like years ago, I was at an event speaking in Spain, and was talking about urban common different things like that, and I brought up municipalized bike shares as an example of a common resource, and someone raised their hand and was like, "Hey, like, that's not commons, like, that's the government." Like, and that's a public-private partnership. Those are corporate companies which are partnering with the city to be able to do that. Like, we've got a commons-based bike system. over here, and we run this as a community, and there's 50 bikes, and they're all painted the same color, and it's completely separate in the whole thing, and like that's commenting, like that's that model. Um, and so, but coming from the United States, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, well I just think of this public bike system as being a commons resource, depending by the name. So I think a lot of it depends on where you're coming from. What's your viewpoint about is what can be commons and what is not a commons. Uh, and there's been a lot of there's certain people in the common space that have the viewpoint that like there's like three very distinct areas. You've got the government, you've got the market, and then you've got the commons. There's a lot of other people that thinks that the commons are weaved through the whole, both the market and the state. And I tend to be more on that part. Like I don't really see very many things that are separated commons.
In one talk, you mentioned that you think a lot of people are already involved in commoning and don't even realize it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're kind of seeing. We call it like commenting without commenting.
Can you
Uh, you know,
actually give an example of that?
well, I mean, there's like people that are, you could say, kind of community land trusts, or people that are living in collective housing together, would be one example. But uh, those that are participating in childcare cooperatives. There's all different like preschool co-ops and that sort of thing. People that are working on community gardens and community space, people that are doing placemaking, people that are doing some sort of any type of kind of contribution to their communities, are participating in commenting. I mean, the semantics around this work always is tricky. It was funny. There was a couple of years ago, I was at a conference in Malaga. That was this kind of new economy conference. And the idea was to like, let's bring all the different aspects of new and alternative and social and all these economies together into one place. And on one level, the whole thing was just hilarious. It was just like we were caricatures of ourselves. Like there was people that were there from the blue economy and the green economy and the orange economy and the solidarity economy and the sharing economy and the new economy and it just like went on and on and on and on. There was the circular economy, and there was probably about 20 different designations of we're doing the economy like this, we're doing the economy like this, and this is our framing, and this is our graphic design, and this is our framework, and like all this whole thing. And then you go from workshop to workshop, and everybody had community land trusts as part of their color coded new economy model, and so sometimes like I just stepped back and had to laugh at ourselves. It's like we've got to get it together a little bit and not be so stuck on framing or the idea that we are presenting something that's new. I mean, one of the things that I've really started to appreciate recently is kind of what has worked historically for communities. No matter what it was called, like what has actually worked. And let's get rid of innovation for a little while, because we've been innovating for a long time and stuff is getting worse. Like things are getting worse and worse and worse as we continue to innovate on a lot of levels. On a number of levels, things are better. But for many people, all this innovation has caused a greater divide and has made things worse for a lot of our communities. And so it's not about, I at the same time, I don't want to kind of idolize the past in a way that's inappropriate. But there are aspects of the ways that our communities operated for a very, very long time that I feel like we need to bring back, and that we need to recognize that, there's nothing new under the sun, and that, uh, we don't have to just start new projects every single time, that we can look and see what's already working in a community and build upon it and, focus on relationships first.
I'm a lover of traditional communities, but I don't think that we need to go into back the way things were.
No.
What I think we need is a new form of traditional communities, like a new tradition that is our tradition in this world,
Yep.
in this modern world.
No, I like
So
that framing.
yeah, And talking of framing, the Systems Change Alliance has gone through exactly this process that you're talking about of saying this is our approach to economy and this is what we believe in, or at least the people behind it. The ideas, well, this is what it is, this is what it is. And we realize that it really doesn't work. What we need is to get together all of the people who believe in similar things and say, let's do something together on all of this. How can we put it all together rather than have one thing versus another thing?
And how has that process been going for you?
Well, we have interest. Now we're trying to figure out what to do with all of the different skills and talents that all of these different organizations have. Next question is, obviously people want to work together.
Mm-hmm.
How do we work together?
Yep.
That's the next question. So do we put on some kind of summits where we're bringing together all of the best of the different ideas, or do we actually find some practical work in ways that the different organizations can help each other and the different approaches can help each other? We don't know yet. It'd be very interesting anyone's opinions on what we should be doing. It's very much at that point of there are connections, and it's really interesting to see those connections. And what is the thing that is really going to bring all of those connections together and turn this kind of scattered movement into something that's really effective? It's kind of like a commoning approach, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, can we find the commons here?
I mean, finding the common ground, finding a way to align those visions and work is, can be a tricky process. But one of the things that I've seen in my own community, and this comes up, again and again and again through, commoning projects in general, but I'll just talk about from my own personal experience. It's the kind of the rubbing shoulder to shoulder, like the actually having a shared work experience that I've seen has deepened relationships the most. Built the most common ground. In my community, there's a big difference I've seen from showing up to a community meeting versus being out and paving a road, or cleaning the gutters and doing whatever skill set or ability that somebody might have to be contributing to that common resource. Those relationships are so much deeper when we work together, and so that's one of the things that I, with my work with Shareable, what we try and do a lot is like, how do we get people together? How do we get people, now it's a lot harder, with the pandemic, but how do we get people together in space together, and do that. So years ago, we launched a mapping campaign to kind of map out all of the different sharing based resources in cities, and the idea was to make this big global map or a network of a map of maps basically. And so instead of doing a straight kind of crowdsourcing of the information and having people just kind of put their different things on the map, the whole thing is we organized kind of community mapping events.
Yeah.
And in the first year, with only like 2 to 4 weeks of notice, we were able to pull together 50 community mapping events that all took place over a 2-week period. And we called them map jams. And the idea, they'd be like music jams, except we're jamming in with information, and people showed up and had potlucks and over the course of a 3-hour evening made a digital map. And right. It wasn't completely conclusive. It was just the starting point. But they left the evening having had discussions about the resources in their community, learning about new things that they didn't know about otherwise, that were right underneath their noses, and then pulling that information into a visible place where anybody else in the community could then access and say, hey, but what about this thing? Oh, but what about that thing? And it was a starting point. It launched the conversation, but it came from a group of people. That's actually how I got to Shareable, is that I'd been in wanting to do a large scale mapping project, I'd done some small kind of mapping stuff before, and my intention as part of my work moving forward was to help communities do these mappings. And Shareable showed up and they had a template for it and they a great how-to guide and this whole thing, and they were doing this big mapping event, and I was like, oh, like I'll get along behind that. And I was living in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and we had 25 people come out. You know, the local paper came and covered it, and we did a whole mapping thing. And it was through doing that collaboration with Shareable that then ended up leading to me working here. But
Mm.
but again, it's the what are those opportunities to come together and produce something or to maintain something, to kind of get your hands in the dirt in some way, but to do it together, and then how do you kind of maintain and build off of those shared experiences?
How do you think we do that now when we're not allowed to meet each other in the streets?
Well, for the last 9 months, as we've been as we've been experiencing this pandemic globally, we've been covering it on Shareable and have now found many stories of people coming together and doing just that, of finding ways to get around it and to support their communities. And we've actually produced a new book, which just
Mm.
came out 2 weeks ago, called uh, Lessons from the First Wave. And the subtitle is Resilience in the Age of COVID-19. But
Right.
there really have been so many ways that people have come, and just a couple of them which are kind of worth mentioning is, I mean, just this rise of mutual aid that's occurred all over the world is just so impressive. Is that people are finding ways to come out of their homes and make sure that their neighbors have food. Make sure that people are being able to get to appointments or getting the medical attention they need. Whatever those basics things are, finding ways to connect with each other, over the internet, or from distance across the yard, or whatever it is, so that people are having an opportunity to have their social isolation issues like mitigated, and kind of mitigate some of that secondary harm that's coming from the pandemic. So in the book we've got probably about 30 different examples of how people are coming together, and some of these things are like, well, how do we support our community businesses? And we've got a guide with a bunch of alternatives to shopping on Amazon Prime, and how to support your local economy even if you have to order online, or remotely, and that sort of thing. How seed libraries are continuing to support communities to grow their own food during the pandemic. We've got a whole how-to guide for starting a local mutual aid network. Or if you want to then go one step forward, we've got a guide for starting a mutual aid fund to figure out how to kind of equitably distribute money, or redistribute money to people who need it in your communities.
You also helped to write a book about sharing in cities. Is that
Yeah,
similar,
so that was what I
similarly
was.
inspiring
Yeah, so
story?
I referenced that earlier. So that was the sharing cities activating the urban commons,
Mm.
and that one, you know, was like I mentioned earlier, but I can go into a little bit more detail. We worked with 15 fellows in 9 different countries to make sure that we had a global perspective around
Mm.
it, and then we took it one step further, and we had about 25 organizations also submitted case studies and policies for the book. And before we even started, put a single word to page, we did about 50 different stakeholder interviews with policymakers, with community organizers, with academics, again, in many countries, just to figure out, like, what is the state of the commons? Like, what do we need to be exploring? And so the whole process, we not only were we kind of writing about the commons, but we were commoning throughout
Mm.
the process as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And then when the book was finished, we paid for it in part with a crowdfunding campaign, and then we crowdsourced the book tour,
Mm.
and we had community groups host their own events.
Mm.
Around the book, and book talks, and made connections to local projects that were similar, and the idea is that all the different projects that we had in the book were replicable. Like, pretty much all of them had been already replicated by more than one city or more than one country. And
Yeah.
so it was showing, these were not place specific. While they were influenced by the places that they were in, and they were adapted and changed by each place, the general framework was something that could be replicated, across country, across culture. And so that's kind of the one of the one of the big focuses of our work at Shareable is to highlight those things. Like what's already working. The idea of there's now over 100 cities across the world that have some sort of a municipalized sharing cities program. Every major large city in Sweden, now has a sharing cities program as part of their city policy. Like Seoul, South Korea, a city of over 20 million people, has one of the leading sharing cities programs in the world. So there is a lot of kind of municipal energy behind it, which is great. But I would argue that there's even though a lot of cities have now taken over like the designation of being a sharing city, Amsterdam being the first sharing city in Europe officially. I would argue that we don't have an actual like a sharing city yet. There isn't that strong model, but the building blocks all exist, and they're just not all in the exact same place. So that's what we did with Sharing Cities Activating the Urban Commons was, what are those building blocks? What if we took all these things and put them together? What would that society look like? What would that community look like? And that's what I have come to really kind of think more deeply about when it comes to systems change is let's look backwards. Like let's look at what that world that we want to live in or that we think that we need to get to be able to not only be sustainable but regenerative. And then we'll look at that society, we'll look at what's inside, and let's just start building let's start building the blocks here and there. And so sure, maybe that small community garden, you would say, okay, well that community garden, it's not going to even feed one family or it's barely going to feed a couple of families, for their food for the year. They still got to get food from other places. It's not like if we just have a bunch of community gardens, that's not going to solve the problem. And from that argument, it's right. A bunch of community gardens are not going to solve the problem. But once we solve the problem, I bet there's going to be a lot of community gardens.
Yeah.
So, and same thing like, with, housing co-ops or, and community land trusts, that sort of thing. Well, community land trusts are not going to solve our housing problem. Tiny houses are not going to solve our housing problem. But if we look forward in the future and we see all what that world looks like, there may very well be a lot of tiny houses, and we're probably going to have shared land and shared housing. That's what we're working. So let's start building those little blocks here and there, and over time, it's all going to aggregate together, and it's going to make the difference, and we're going to be able to get to the change in that way.
If you were to imagine that future that you see, what are the three main points, three main systemic changes that you would like to see?
Yeah, I mean, well, one, we've got to let go of anthropocentrism. Like we've got to let go of humans being the prodigal sons,
Hmm.
and unless we do that, I don't think anything else is going to work. We're eating through our resources at a huge rate. We have uh, now every year. This year was a little different, but almost every single year we're now using up our share of resources for the year that can be regenerate earlier and earlier and earlier. Typically by August,
Hmm.
we've used up the amount of planetary resources which can regenerate. And so as that comes back, before it used to be November, and then it was October, and now it's September, then it was August, um, and and so that's incredibly concerning. We're now seeing this fourth great wave of extinction that's happening of species all over the place, and our kind of just biological system is under threat. And so until we start to deprioritize human convenience over the top of the rest of the biological system, I don't think we're going to be around in 100 years. Like I think the clock is on. So, that's the number one thing is that from a systems perspective is that we stop thinking that we're the greatest thing since, since the history of the planet, and we're going to have to let that go. And we've been raised to feel that way. The system is set up to show that we are the pinnacle of development. and so there's going to be a sadness. There's going to kind of be a collective trauma which occurs to release that. But we can release that. We can do that as a group. So I think that's the number one thing. The other one is really just to the prioritization of relationships, and that for me is like that really is the pinnacle. And you were mentioning the idea of creating a kind of new traditionalism in some way, new traditions and of society, and I think part of that is going to be those kind of interpersonal connections. There was a study that was done in the United States in the 1980s that found that the average person living in the U.S. had about 3 close friends. And on average, 3 close friends, people that they could rely on, if they need to get bailed out of jail, if they were having some sort of a issue with their partner, who they could really drop into and have a deep conversation and connection with and could feel supported by, when they needed it. The same study was just done in the last couple of years and found that the average person living in the United States has 1 close friend. And that's the average. So think about how many people don't have anybody that they feel like
Yeah.
they can talk to or they're connected to. A huge percentage of people.
Yeah.
And that is something that is incredibly concerning to me, and that I think is going to need to change. There's been a lot of studies that have been found, that have been done, that have found that it's the both breadth and depth of our relationships which are the greatest determinants of survival during a disaster or crisis. There was a study that was done in the 90s looking at the I think it was 95 Chicago heat wave. There was a study that was done in Japan in 2011, which is a lot of people focus on right now during following the triple disaster of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. And they found that all things being equal, in an area, that it was, if somebody had more friends, it was more likely that they would have gotten to higher ground, had been able to get out of their house, all these different things, than if they didn't have those friends. And that you could have all of the early warning systems, all of the technological fixes that you can dream of, which they have for tsunamis in Japan, and it didn't matter if the person didn't have any friends. So we need to prioritize the relationships, and it's something that I am I, I am having a sense of hope for right now because of the pandemic. Like, people are realizing how much they miss social interaction
Yes.
because it's been like totally cut off, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are realizing, man, I didn't have a lot of friends before, but now I'm really feeling lonely.
Mm.
And oh man, now that I'm not able to have these casual acquaintances or be in the office with people and have these social relationships, they're realizing, about, that what happens when you don't prioritize your personal relationships, when you don't prioritize your relationship with your family, or the things that you take for granted. And so people are realizing, I've realized myself, that, man, like, I probably could have invested a little bit more time and energy into maintaining some relationships. So now when stuff is really hitting the fan, there's a little bit more people that are there to show up, or to talk to on the phone or whatever else. And so I'm
You can
hopeful that,
imagine if we were living in large family tribes, and you have your grandma and your parents and your uncle and all of that, and this pandemic hits and you can't talk to anyone. You would barely even notice.
yeah,
It would be just like, yeah, this is fun.
yeah. I
But
mean, and
we really
living in,
noticed it in this isolated living. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and personally, like, I have been sheltered from it probably more than the vast majority of people,
Mm.
living in a small community of a couple of hundred people. And although, we're not in a bubble together, there's enough people that are in close proximity and separated from the city that, we do have physically distanced dinners. We are
Mm.
able to do outdoor movie screenings
Hmm.
and have people all spread out apart from each other. And we've been able to continue having community work days where we're coming out and working on the road, and then having a physically distanced lunch where
Mm.
as part of that work party where people are all apart. And and so I've definitely had felt that benefit of having a tight knit community during the pandemic. And so it's definitely made me appreciate where I'm living even more. I was living before moving back here. I was living in a communal house with, I think, about 15 people, and just the difference between that of now having my own space within a community of 200 people versus having a shared room with 15 people, and just all the politics which go involved, and how difficult it's been for people living in community who want to be able to have relationships with people living outside of the house as well, but then what that means to then potentially the extra harm and everything else that goes in there, versus living
Mm.
in one's own place but within larger community, being able
Yes.
to kind of navigate that and negotiate that for yourself in a different way,
Mhm.
has its perks for sure.
So when you mentioned the prodigal son, I think that that story is actually quite relevant when you tell the whole story. People hear the prodigal son without even the full context these days. So the prodigal son is the son who went off and gambled and drank and spent all his money and had a really good time. And the point is that he had a good time. He spent all his money. He used up all his resources.
Yep.
He he was going to die on the streets, yeah.
Yep.
And he comes back to his family, and his family welcomes him back and says, "It's great to have you back." And I think what we can hope for is that nature will
Yeah.
welcome us back like that. That when we decide that we are coming back, that we will be welcomed back into that natural ecosystem. And
As long as there's an ecosystem still around to welcome us back. But
yeah,
yes.
we can't go too far. There's a limit
Yeah.
there. Um, of these the different stories that you've heard, can you tell us something really inspiring, an inspiring story about sharing?
Well, the thing that the thing that it really inspires me all the time is when people just get it, and when the idea of sharing, of resource sharing, community clicks for people with lots of different worldviews.
Hmm.
And that it's kind of like it can be a pan-political concept, and that's definitely where we try and couch our work. And so
Hmm.
an example of this, and and I won't name who the policymakers are specifically, but I'll say the region.
Yeah.
But I was working with a group in France, and there was a local NGO that put on a big sharing event, and you put on a huge full sharing festival, and there was different projects all over the city and the whole thing. And I was able to come out for it. And the night before, I was able to sit down with the local mayor and have dinner and talk about sharing and resources and all these things. And he was trying to figure out, like, what is the how can I convey this to my community? Like, how can I start with sharing? And so we started talking about it. And it's like, oh, there's like this community, had a lot of industry for a period of time. There's a lot of people that were part of the trades, and that industry has now left. But there's still a lot of people that know how to work with their hands, that have been part of this. And so we're having the conversation around sharing. I'm like, it seems like a tool library would be a great place to start. Like, people will be able to understand that. And we talked about a number of other things, but he kept coming back to, he was like, yeah, the tool library, the tool library. And the next day, there we were at this sharing event, and there was other city officials and the whole thing. And he was like, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna start a tool library. Like, I'm gonna commit to doing that right now, and like used all the points that I made the night before about why it was important. And that was great unto itself. And it was like, okay, so we'll have this conversation. This policymaker all of a sudden gets it. The next day, going to commit resources and time and support to being able to make this thing happen in the community as a gateway, to be able to then grow additional sharing. And and so that was that. I would consider that as like a wonderful story. and we actually set up our book, Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons, in a way that people could print out a single page and bring it to their city council members or their city council meeting and say, hey, like, we want to do this. And there's a number of examples of different people that have come back to us and said, yeah, I took that thing around participatory budgeting, and the city council member like said, yes, we've been looking for something just like this, and they started to make it happen. But what was more impressive to me in this example in France is that then later that night, the next night, I was sitting down with one of the kind of regional planning director who had much more libertarian views. And again, I'm sitting there talking about sharing, and I brought up the story of Stone Soup, and while he had completely different opposite views from political views from the mayor, who was a communist from the Communist Party. We started talking about it, and again, this policymaker who has much more libertarian views was like, "Oh yeah, I totally get it, and you could do this thing, and we could look at this on a regional scale, and the way that this would work." And so, again, we were talking earlier about the different, framings. It's the blue economy, it's the orange economy, it's the green economy, it's the what have you. I think when we can drop some of our rhetoric and we can just really get down to the base of, what does this mean? What does it look like? What are the real benefits of doing these projects? Then it becomes, apolitical, and you can get people on board that you would think would be adversaries, can be changed into advocates. And we've seen that again and again, all around the world, of people shifting from being, those that you would think would be adversaries to becoming advocates. So that's definitely kind of one of the inspirational stories, and there's so many more that are like that.
I've really enjoyed talking to political groups about cooperatives.
Yep.
Because generally the answer I get about cooperatives is that we haven't really thought about cooperatives very much, but it sounds like a good idea. And then the more I talk about it, the more they say, yeah, that sounds like our ideas. And so I get a talk one day to some what we would call right-wing capitalist kind of group, and they say, yeah, this is capitalism in action. This is like how we can use capitalism to solve the society's problems. And then you talk to a group of communists, and they say, this is communism in action. And then I talk to a religious Christian group, and they say the same thing. They say, this is Christian values applied to this. And of course, you get the kind of green environmental movement saying it's their idea as well. And I think this has got a lot of hope. If we can actually get people to see it as their own, then we can all own it together. Then it becomes a common vision. And
indeed, getting back to the commons there.
We get back to the commons, yeah.
I mean, and just to finish, go back to one of your questions earlier, because you were asking, those three different things around systems, and I talked about two, and the third one is just how we build collective resilience in the wake of disasters. And that involves coming together, when those disasters occur, and then also how do we kind of build greater resilience, knowing that we're living in a disastrous time. And the way that we deal on a with the symptoms of climate change, with those fires, with those floods. I mean, this year we had the first gigafire in the world took place in California, where over 1 million acres burned in a single fire. Our worst fire season on record. It's been the worst season for hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. We've run out of names for them. There's been so many. We are living in incredibly disastrous times.
Wow, and I didn't even hear about it. That shows how much.
Again, one of the things about the pandemic is this is the first time in over 100 years that everyone on the planet has faced the same disaster at the same time. Or at least that we've perceived that, because I would argue that we are facing the same disaster of climate change at the same time, but we don't. But because the symptoms are different, we haven't made the connections in the same way. And so here we are in this time of of great disaster, and it's just the beginning. Is my is what the scientists are telling, and what my perspective is that this is just this is just the early stages of climate, of living in an erratic climate, and and so if we can kind of figure out how to work together during these moments, one, figure out how to work together now before the big major disasters come is the most important thing. But then if we can figure out how to work together during disasters in general, we are going to be able to survive as a society. But if we turn against each other, if it's like in the disaster movies where everyone is hoarding and freaking out and running amok, we're going to be doomed. And through my work in the last couple of years with the response, we've seen example after example of the ways that people are figuring it out, and that most people, most of the time, rise to the challenge and create a community of care and support during disasters. It's a very small percentage of people which break down, and the kind of and yet the news coverage typically focuses on either a very few heroes, often that are coming from outside of the community, and producing this kind of more charity myth, that the vast majority of people are victims, and those that aren't victims are criminals, and that disasters bring out the criminality. And it then goes to justify so much secondary harm, the extrajudicial killings, of people running over other people, of police being able to be, judge, juror, and executioner. And if we can kind of break down some of those myths, and again through story, show that that really disasters aren't as scary, or the fallout from disasters don't have to be as scary as we've been told that they are, then we can really kind of live into this next version of society.
I've been reading The Course in Miracles lately, which is a great book, though rather difficult going. And a large part of the point is that we have a choice between love and fear. We can choose a loving response, or we can choose a fearful response. And if you realize what comes when you choose those responses, so we can choose to focus on the love and care and the connection and how we can support each other and create a loving world, or we can choose to focus on the fear and the distancing and all of these terrible things that might happen and create a scary world. So I think what we're talking about is really, can we focus on that love, and can we create that connection as the thing that we build, and we build it by living it, by sharing.
Yep.
We build a world of sharing. By caring, we build a world of caring.
Indeed. So let us all share more and get more, be fed by our communities, and through that interaction and that shared experience, and we talk a lot at Shareable about the sharing transformation, that kind of through sharing, through interaction, through collaboration, not only are we transforming the world around us, but we're transforming ourselves.
Yeah. So what kind of people do you think should get in touch with Shareable and should get involved in the work?
Yeah, I mean, people can get in touch with us. So, one, if you're interested in doing anything in your communities, starting any new sharing projects, we have over 300 how-to guides to start to do anything from creating community co-working to community gardens, to putting on permaculture blitzes, to building out public transportation hubs, all these things, all the way down to how to share a chicken, with a neighbor. And so those resources are available. But also, we, like I was mentioning earlier, we provide a lot of different services as well. So we work with with academics and helping to kind of translate research into popular media and support the storytelling to get that research and information outside of kind of academic bubbles and silos. And we work with policymakers on how to kind of rethink about their public infrastructure and how they democratize access to it. And then, as I was mentioning, community organizers and groups that are wanting to kind of share more and find a way. And so we've got, at this point in time, thousands of stories, the ways that people are sharing, and hundreds of guides to help people. And we're here to provide technical assistance and to sort of support people to get those projects off the ground.
And where would they find you?
So they can come and find us at shareable.net is our website. People can contact me directly, tom@shareable.net. You can find the Response podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. And then our response film is we made a film this last year about Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and all of the mutual aid centers that popped up, and it's a 30-minute film. It's won a number of awards. We had our television premiere earlier this year in the United States, and it's a really good tool for convening communities to then have a discussion about what type of resilience projects they might want to do. And so we'd initially planned on doing a kind of a global tour with the film, and we had a bunch of people that were hosting in-person screenings, and some people got to do it before the pandemic. But we've pivoted, and people are doing online screenings and having kind of online community events, and so the film is available for anybody to get for free just by getting in touch with us at Shareable.
The Response, yes?
The Response is the name of the podcast.
And Shareable is SHAREABLE.
.net.
.net. Okay, lovely. Wonderful to meet you and talk to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Appreciate you and the Systems Change Alliance for having me. And Shareable is now a member of the Alliance as well. So we're looking forward to continued collaboration.
May the collaboration and sharing and commenting continue.
Indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.